My husband was supposed to be on a business trip in Chicago. My water broke a full week before my due date, and I headed to the hospital alone. What I found there was my husband, gently supporting the lower back of his pregnant mistress as they walked into the maternity ward. I didn't say a word. After giving birth, I took our daughter and vanished as if I had been erased from the earth. He lost his mind trying to find me. Just past 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sharp, tightening pain in my lower abdomen. The first thing I did was roll over and check my iPhone. The screen illuminated the dark room, displaying a text message David had sent 2 days ago. The corporate merger is in its final phase. I absolutely can't leave Chicago right now. I'll definitely be back next week. Take care of yourself. I had simply replied, "Okay." He never texted back after that. He must have been incredibly busy. Or perhaps he assumed that one-word reply was the end of the conversation. The contractions weren't regular yet. They came in waves, spaced out, like a distant tide slowly rolling toward the shore. I leaned against the headboard of our king-sized bed and sat there for a while, resting one hand on my belly. I could feel a heavy, squeezing pressure rising from deep within. My due date was still 7 days away. I figured she might come early, but not this early. I got out of bed, keeping my movements as slow and deliberate as possible. First, I pulled my hospital bag down from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. My driver's license, Blue Cross insurance card, birth plan, a change of clothes, travel-sized toiletries, phone charger, and wireless earbuds. Everything was exactly where I had packed it. Then I washed my face, brushed my teeth, changed my clothes, and tied my hair back. Outside the window, the Seattle sky was a deep, bruised indigo. The amber glow of the streetlights cast the shadows of the maple trees across our balcony curtains. The silhouettes trembled faintly in the Pacific Northwest wind. As I slipped on my shoes in the foyer, I glanced at the top tier of the shoe rack. David's navy blue L bean moccasins were sitting there. Whenever he was out of town, those slippers were left with the toes pointing inward. They hadn't moved from that exact position in over 2 weeks. A thin layer of dust had settled on the suede. You wouldn't notice it unless you looked closely, but it was undeniably there. When the contractions narrowed from 15 minutes to about 7 or 8 minutes apart, I left the apartment. The motion sensor lights in the hallway flicked on. The warm yellow glow gently followed me down to the lobby and quietly clicked off behind me. The Uber Black arrived faster than I expected. The driver loaded my bag into the trunk. I took one last look at the glass entrance of my luxury condo building. There were no lights on inside my unit. The sleek black SUV glided down the empty downtown streets. The streetlights slid past the window, one row at a time. My gaze remained fixed in the same direction, hypnotized by the constant, rhythmic speed. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. He must have realized what was happening. The car slowed down slightly, taking the speed bumps with absolute care. When we arrived at the hospital, I handed him a crisp $50 bill as a tip and walked straight into the emergency room. The triage nurse asked a few standard questions. When I showed her my contraction timer app, she immediately said we needed to get me up to labor and delivery. The hours between the pre-dawn darkness and late morning dragged on endlessly. My cervix dilated millimeter by millimeter. The color of the curtains in the labor room shifted from deep navy to a pale, grayish white, and finally to a stark, cold, fluorescent glare. During that time, the nurses checked the fetal monitor twice. The electrode pads on my stomach were replaced once. The dosage of Pitocin was slightly adjusted. The intervals between the pain shrank from 7 minutes to 4 and then to 2. In the brief moments when the agony receded, I turned my head and looked out the window. The sky over the neighboring high-rise was brightening, shifting from charcoal to a soft, washed-out blue. A few wispy clouds lingered at the edge of the horizon, glowing with a translucent, pale gold light in the morning sun. In the bed next to mine, separated only by a curtain, a pregnant woman was whispering to her husband. The man was holding her hand, using his free hand to stroke her hair. Their voices were hushed, occasionally punctuated by soft, intimate laughter. I shifted my body away from the sound, letting my eyes escape back to the window, watching the morning light creep across the windowsill. When I was 6 centimeters dilated, they wheeled me into the delivery room. The delivery bed was narrower than the one in triage. The stirrups were adjusted. The scrub nurses were prepping the stainless steel instruments. It must have been shift change. Someone pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. A figure in dark blue surgical scrubs crossed the periphery of my vision. I couldn't see his face, only his back. The man stood by the fetal monitoring station at the foot of the bed, leaning over to read the screen and adjust the digital readouts. A fresh contraction hit me like a freight train. I curled inward, my hands gripping the metal bed rails so hard my knuckles turned white. My eyes dropped, staring blindly at my own fingers crushing the sterile sheets. That was when I heard the voice from the foot of the bed. It was slightly muffled beneath a blue surgical mask, but the cadence, the spacing of the words, the specific rhythm of the breathing. I had listened to that voice for far too long. It was the exact tone David used when he casually agreed to something, the slightly rushed tempo he used when checking the time during a conference call. Chart verified in the Epic system, cross-referenced with yesterday's blood panels. Keep the Pitocin levels steady. I raised my head. David's profile was perfectly framed between the glaring white surgical lights and the blue fabric of his mask. His eyes were cast downward, glued to the iPad in his hands. I knew the exact contour of his cheekbones above that mask. I knew the line of his jaw. I had stared at that face every single day for 3 years of marriage. I knew the shape of his eyes when they were closed, when they were open, and the precise angle they narrowed when illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. Right now, those eyes were locked on the medical chart. They never looked up. My name is printed clearly on the spouse section of our county-issued marriage certificate. And right now, I was lying on a delivery table, while my husband stood at the foot of the bed in hospital scrubs. He was the attending obstetrician. He was standing next to a fetal monitor, reading his own wife's medical chart, verifying her blood work. That horrifying reality circled my brain 3 or 4 times before it finally, heavily, dropped into place. I didn't call out his name. I didn't make a sound. I didn't move. Another massive contraction ripped through my body, and I used the agony as an excuse to curl inward and bury my face in my chest, tearing my gaze away from him. I stared back down at my fingers gripping the rail. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple, slid past my cheekbone, paused at the edge of my earlobe, and dropped onto the white pillowcase, leaving a small, dark stain. The heart monitor kept beeping in a steady, relentless rhythm. The head nurse confirmed something with him in a low voice. While David spoke, I felt a density of pressure heavier than before, like countless tidal waves stacking upon each other in the same direction. A few minutes later, David walked over to the scrub sink against the wall. He began the standard pre-surgical hand-washing routine. The sound of running water echoed with brutal clarity in the sterile silence of the room. The moment he turned around, I checked one last time. The eyebrows above the mask, the placement of his eyes, the hospital ID badge clipped to his chest, displaying his credentials, his broad shoulders, his posture, the exact crease of his scrub-top zipper stopping right at his sternum. There was no mistake. It was him. His movements were smooth and precise, the muscle memory of a man who had delivered countless babies in this exact room. In this specific moment, in this delivery ward, within the hospital's digital registry, his identity was merely the on-call OB-GYN. He was only my husband in the confines of our apartment and within the pages of our marriage certificate. Having finished his prep, David returned to the foot of my bed. He stood exactly where he could see the fetal monitor and my physical reactions simultaneously. The nurses began moving in flawless synchronization with the rhythm of his commands. The rest of the delivery proceeded with terrifying efficiency. There wasn't a single unnecessary delay. David's voice drifted out from behind the mask. Every instruction he gave was just a fraction of a second faster than any other doctor. He knew exactly what was going to happen at every stage, predicting the medical timeline with absolute perfection. But beyond that, there was nothing. No lingering silence, no special look, no deviation from standard protocol. The moment my daughter was born, her first cry was sharp and brief. It sounded like a tiny key sliding into a lock. David glanced down exactly once. Then he immediately turned and handed the baby off to the neonatal nurse, leaving the wiping and airway checks to her. He shifted his focus entirely to clamping the umbilical cord and beginning the sutures. Between his precise stitches, I stared at his eyes beneath the surgical lights. They were fiercely concentrated, cold, devoid of any personal emotion. For 3 years, those eyes had looked exactly like that when reading legal contracts on his desk, when scanning Google Maps for directions, or when I placed a hot bowl of soup on the dining table and walked behind his chair. Those eyes almost never looked at me. Now, those same eyes were fixed on the most intimate part of my body, monitoring nothing but the progress of his sutures and my physical recovery. He had absolutely no idea. He didn't know that the body he was stitching back together belonged to his wife. He didn't know that the newborn crying a few feet away was his own flesh and blood. He just kept suturing with practiced, flawless technique. Then, in his calm, authoritative voice, he announced the standard post-op vitals. Blood loss is within normal limits. Keep her in the recovery room for 2 hours. Page me immediately if there are any complications. David signed the digital chart. His footsteps as he walked out were perfectly even, completely unbothered. The hem of his white coat fluttered slightly from the draft of the heavy door opening. Then the door clicked shut. I lay on the delivery bed. A tiny, warm weight was placed against my chest. My daughter's body still held a damp, radiant heat. The second she touched my skin, she wriggled faintly, and then grew completely still. Her eyelashes, wet and clumped together, were tightly closed. Her breathing was so fragile, like a tiny aquatic creature that had just broken the surface of the water. Down the hallway, David's footsteps faded away. Eventually, they were entirely swallowed by the distant ding of an elevator arriving. I placed my hand on my daughter's back, feeling her microscopic spine rise and fall with every breath. Outside the window, the morning sun shifted from a pale blue to a bright, uniform, golden warmth. The entire world just kept spinning at its normal, indifferent speed. During my 2 hours in the recovery room, I took photographs of every single piece of data I could access on the patient portal. I was completely undisturbed. A nurse came in exactly once to check my vitals. For the rest of the time, the pale green door was my only barrier against the hallway. The overhead fluorescent lights reflected coldly off the polished wood. I pulled out my iPhone and opened the Notes app. I didn't give the new document a title. I just started typing on the second line. For 2 solid hours, I documented every memory, text message, and timeline detail from the past 3 days in strict chronological order. David's flight itinerary to Chicago had been emailed to me 2 weeks ago. Judging by the margins and font sizing, the first page was a PDF printed days in advance. His supposed project was at a corporate high-rise on the complete opposite side of the country. Yet, the maternity ward of this Seattle hospital was only a few miles from our apartment. For him to be here, working a full shift, completely shattered his alibi. Even if it were an emergency cover shift, the logistics made absolutely no sense. The wear on the soles of his shoes, his posture, the specific way he held his pen, his flawless, unhesitating navigation of the hospital's complex paging system. When I cross-referenced all this data, it led to one inescapable conclusion. His staff badge was not a temporary guest pass. He was officially on the payroll. He worked here. I lined up the evidence. I reviewed it line by line, ensuring every single bullet point had at least 2 pieces of corroborating proof. I saved the file with a string of meaningless, random numbers. While I executed this task, the warm little body slept peacefully in my arms. Her breathing was soft, and she occasionally made tiny smacking sounds in her sleep. I set the phone down next to her, tilting the screen so the harsh light would not hit her face. The daylight outside was now glaring and stable. I was no longer paying attention to how fast the hours were slipping by. My daughter turned her head toward my heart. Her tiny, clenched fist relaxed for a split second in her sleep, then curled back up tight. When the nurse came back for her second round of vitals, she smiled and said I was ready to be transferred to a private postpartum suite. I asked, keeping my voice utterly casual. Who was the attending OB, GYN, on shift this morning? The nurse didn't think anything of it and cheerfully offered a name. It wasn't the name printed on David's badge. She paused for a moment, then added a half-remembered clarification. Actually, I think the doctor in your delivery room was a specialist filling in from another department today. He used to be stationed over at the Bellevue campus. I just nodded and said, I see. I didn't ask anything else. I leaned back against the pillows, feeling the reassuring, steady rhythm of the tiny weight in my arms. Once settled into my private room, I picked up my phone again. I opened my most frequently texted contact and sent a message. My water broke early. The baby is here. We are both safe. The read receipt appeared instantly, but no reply came. About 20 minutes later, the screen lit up. Why did it happen so early? Which hospital are you at? I'm still drowning in the final closing documents for the merger. I'll fly back later. Is that all right? I stared at that paragraph for several seconds. I didn't text back. I placed the phone face down on the bedside table. My daughter woke up again, gave a small grunt, wiggled to find a more comfortable angle against my ribs, and fell right back asleep. By late afternoon, the sunlight slanted heavily through the blinds, painting the hospital walls in a rich, melancholic gold. That night, I didn't ask David a single question. I didn't tell him which hospital I was admitted to, and he didn't send another text. Deep in the night, waking from a fitful sleep, I checked the screen. 0 notifications. Outside the window, the Seattle skyline flickered with a million different lives. The distant skyscrapers were blurred by a hazy orange smog, painting the sharp edges of the rooftops in a fading, uniform silhouette. On the afternoon of my third day, while filling my thermos at the hot water dispenser down the hall, I saw them. The corridor was remarkably long. The overhead fluorescent tubes created an unbroken stripe of freezing white light. The woman's figure was much clearer now than when I had seen her behind the triage curtain. Her belly was undeniably swollen, though she looked about a month behind my own pregnancy. David was standing right next to her. He had one hand resting possessively on the small of her back, and he was holding a sonogram printout in his other hand. They were coming from the second-floor escalator, turning the corner toward the high-risk OB wing. David was murmuring something low into her ear. She turned her profile to him, replied, and let out a soft laugh. In that exact moment, David's shoulders relaxed, dipping slightly toward her. I froze at the end of the hallway. I didn't take another step forward. The boiling water from the dispenser hissed violently into my metal thermos, sending thick white steam curling into the frigid, heavily air-conditioned air. David was perfectly matching his stride to her slower, pregnant waddle. From the day I met him until now, David had never once slowed his walking pace for me. The difference was minuscule, a matter of inches per second. But having spent 3 years trailing slightly behind him, I recognized it instantly. It was undeniable. I capped my thermos. Holding the burning metal against my chest, I pivoted sharply and took a different corridor back to my room, entirely avoiding their path. The heavy door of my room clicked shut behind me. The lock engaged with a sharp metallic snap. My daughter was sleeping quietly in her plastic bassinet, her chest rising and falling in perfect symmetry. I placed the thermos on the bedside table, the heat radiating through the stainless steel against my fingertips. The afternoon sun had crawled across the floorboards, painting the edges of the freshly changed hospital sheets in a vibrant, molten gold. A tiny hand had slipped out from the edge of her swaddle. Her fingers were curled delicately. In the afternoon light, her fingernails looked like translucent pink sea glass. I stood there watching her for a very long time, until the sunbeam crept away from her knuckles and moved toward the wall. Finally, I snapped out of my trance. I picked up my phone and scrolled deep into my contacts until I found her name. The line rang 5 or 6 times before she picked up. Her voice sounded raspy, like she had just woken up, or maybe she was deep in the middle of a brutal work sprint. She spoke slowly. Hello? Hannah, it's Sarah. I have a question. Yeah. Does your firm still handle covert document storage and untraceable logistics? We do. You need it? I think I do. I need someone on the outside to help me move without leaving a digital footprint on a shared network. When? In 2 weeks. Can you come get me? Understood. Text me the address and the time frame. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the hospital bed. The light outside shifted from bright gold to a bruised, fading orange. The silence of the room was filled entirely by the white noise of my daughter's breathing, slow and steady like a flower unfolding its petals in time-lapse. I checked myself out on the fourth day. I didn't tell any of my family members. I didn't ask David to come pick me up. When the yellow cab pulled up to the discharge loading zone, the driver got out and expertly strapped the infant car seat into the back row. I loaded my duffel bag into the trunk and slid in next to my baby. As the taxi pulled out of the hospital's main gate, the morning sun pierced through the side window. It landed perfectly on the soft peach fuzz of my sleeping daughter's cheek, bathing her closed eyelids in a warm, buttery light. I pulled out my phone and reviewed the digital dossier I had compiled. I double-checked the dates and timestamps. Then I transferred the entire file from my Notes app into a heavily encrypted cloud vault. Outside the window, the city flashed by in a blur of motion. Traffic lights, construction barricades, pedestrians huddled against the wind. Each landmark entered my field of vision and was immediately left behind. In the rear-view mirror, the massive hospital complex shrank. At first, it was a towering block of concrete. Then it became a square gray mass I could cover with my thumb. Finally, it vanished into a blurry speck on the skyline. It was early afternoon by the time we reached my downtown condo. The driver handed me the car seat, and I carried my daughter up the elevator. The hallway motion sensors tracked my every step, lighting up in a sterile sequence. I turned my key in the lock and pushed the heavy oak door open. The stale air of the apartment washed over me. It smelled faintly of dust and the lingering trace of the Tom Ford aftershave David had used days ago. I gently set my daughter down on the pale gray rug in the living room. She barely stirred. This apartment was a space I truly believed would never hold another soul. And now, this tiny new existence was breathing inside it. I stood in the foyer, staring at the empty living room. The home we had built together was rapidly decomposing into a temporary shelter for just me and my daughter. The top shelf of the shoe rack was completely empty where his moccasins usually sat. It looked like a gaping hole left behind by an uprooted tree. I didn't have any desire to fill it. I tossed my keys onto the wooden credenza. In the dead silence of the apartment, the crash of the metal keys echoed violently. Over the next few days, I did exactly one thing. I systematically dismantled everything in this luxury condo that belonged to our shared life. I emptied the entire left side of the walk-in closet. I folded every single one of David's custom-tailored suits and Brooks Brothers dress shirts, packing them tightly into a heavy-duty U-Haul cardboard box. I cleared the second shelf of the master bathroom, tossing in his electric razor and a brand of expensive shampoo I had never seen him buy before. I found a carton of premium orange juice on the top shelf of the refrigerator, with an expiration date approaching fast. I took it out, set it on the kitchen island, and decided to just let it rot. I opened the drawer of the entryway table and dug out an emergency prepaid SIM card. I tossed my old journals, our framed wedding vows, and our marriage certificate into an opaque manila folder. I did all of this while my daughter slept. She was incredibly quiet the entire time. She only woke up once, letting out a tiny whimper, before settling right back to sleep. A week later, after verifying my forwarding addresses and finalizing the encrypted files, I taped the U-Haul box shut. I slapped a prepaid FedEx label on top, addressed directly to the administrative wing of the hospital. When the FedEx courier arrived at my door, he paused to read the delivery address, raised an eyebrow, and handed me the digital scanner to sign. I scribbled my signature. At 3 in the afternoon on that exact same day, I sent one final text to David's personal number. "I've been discharged. I shipped your belongings to your office. Don't look for me or the baby." I typed the date at the very end. Before pressing send, I stared at the glowing green bubble for 10 seconds. Then I hit the button. That was all I sent. Before the read receipt could even register, I ejected the SIM card from my iPhone. I dropped the tiny chip into a paper bag in the kitchen drawer, slid the new prepaid card into the tray, and booted it up. Every single contact and file I owned had already been migrated to a burner device. The FedEx courier hauled the heavy cardboard box out the door. The sound of his scanner zipping into his holster was sharp and dry. As he left, the front door clicked shut. The deadbolt echoed down the empty hallway once, quickly swallowed by the ping of the elevator arriving. The air in the apartment settled into a deafening stillness. It felt like the microsecond of silence right before a heavy book is slammed shut forever. On the day I finally left, I never looked back. I carried my daughter out through the glass lobby doors. The crisp morning sunlight spilled across the concrete steps, illuminating the scuff marks of thousands of shoes in a warm, forgiving glow. My daughter was deeply asleep in her car seat. Her eyelashes cast tiny, crescent-shaped shadows against her cheeks. The sunlight crawled across the rim of her carrier and eventually landed on the back of my hand, gripping the plastic handle tight. By the time the black SUV breached the city limits, the familiar towering skyscrapers had thinned out. The dense clusters of commercial high-rises faded into the rearview mirror. The manicured suburban neighborhoods began to stretch out, flattening against the horizon. The highway widened, flanked by endless stretches of pine trees. The asphalt was scarred with spiderweb cracks and fresh tar patches. The driver pulled over near the entrance of the interstate toll booth, tapping his GPS screen to verify the route. I leaned my head against the cold glass, watching the green highway signs reflect in the side mirror. They shrank into tiny green pixels, eventually disappearing completely as we took the sweeping curve toward the mountains. Halfway through the 3-hour drive, we pulled into a sprawling highway rest stop. I took my daughter out to nurse her and change her diaper. The wind howling through the rest stop was sharper and more abrasive than the city breeze. It slapped against my face, carrying the raw scent of pine needles and damp earth from the distant logging routes. After feeding, my daughter stared up at the canopy of the massive evergreen trees bordering the parking lot. The afternoon sun filtered through the violently shaking branches, flashing between deep forest green and pale, washed-out sunlight. It looked like a massive, frayed tapestry being whipped violently by the wind. When we got back on the road, the highway narrowed into a winding 2-lane country blacktop. The houses were spaced miles apart. Ancient farmhouses wrapped in dead ivy flew past the windows. Expansive agricultural fields stretched out beneath the sun, broken into massive geometric grids of brown and gold. By the time we arrived, the sky was already bleeding into twilight. Around a sharp bend, an old, sprawling property came into view. It was a rustic, red brick farmhouse with a steep slate roof. In the front yard, a massive oak tree stood sentry, its branches heavy with late autumn leaves trembling in the chilling wind. As the SUV idled outside the iron gate, a figure stepped out from the porch. Her silhouette sharpened as she walked out of the shadows. Her long hair was tied back in a messy, effortless bun, and she was wearing a faded Carhartt work jacket. It was Hannah. Hannah walked straight up to the car, placed her hands on her hips, and peered through the window at the baby carrier. Then she looked up at me. "Bags in the trunk?" "Just one box. And the car seat. I can carry her." "I got it," she said. Hannah's movements were shockingly gentle. She tested the weight of the carrier first, then smoothly lifted it from my hands. She gave the sleeping baby one long, assessing look, then gestured for me to follow her inside. We walked through a mudroom and stepped into a space that had clearly been meticulously prepped for us. The bedroom was on the east wing of the house. The windows faced the sprawling backyard. Through the glass, I could see the jagged branches of the oak tree scraping against the darkening sky. The bed linens were a soft, washed-out gray cotton. A small brass reading lamp and a single hardcover novel rested on the nightstand. Hannah placed the baby carrier gently onto a low cedar bench beneath the window. She didn't bombard me with questions. She didn't offer useless platitudes. When I walked over to the glass, she just stood in the doorway and said one thing. "Dinner is in an hour. Take your time and breathe." My first week in the country dissolved into a blur, dictated entirely by my daughter's feeding and sleeping schedule. She adapted to the strange, drafty farmhouse much faster than I anticipated. Maybe it was because she liked the constant sound of Hannah's heavy boots walking across the hardwood floors, or maybe the angle of the sunlight hitting the crib was softer than the glaring city windows. Hannah worked remotely from a converted office down the hall. She would occasionally push my door open and ask if I needed a hand. Sometimes I said yes. Most times I didn't need anything. By the third week, I finally cracked open my MacBook. The screen flared to life. My desktop, my folders, my icons, everything was exactly where I had left it in my former life. I created a fresh Word document. I typed a heading on the first line, And on the second line, I began reconstructing the absolute timeline of David's betrayal. I bulleted every piece of evidence, leaving precise line breaks to separate the dates. The dossier grew, page by page, line by line. It felt like I was paving a long, agonizing road with bricks of pure data. One afternoon, the wind ripped through the oak tree outside my window. A heavy beam of autumn light slanted across my desk, illuminating the edge of my keyboard in a dusty, amber glow. The light spilled over the black text I was typing. I pulled my hands away from the keys. I glanced to my right. My daughter was fast asleep in a wooden bassinet near the window. Tiny speckles of sunlight filtered through the leaves, dancing across her knitted blanket. Every time the wind shifted, the constellation of light rearranged itself. I turned back to the glowing screen. I finalized the layout, tagging every single event with exact GPS coordinates and timestamps. Life out here in the rural Pacific Northwest operated on an entirely different frequency. I never needed an alarm clock. The blinding sunrise woke me up. When the dawn light flooded the east-facing windows, the entire room felt submerged in a freezing, crystal-clear illumination. My daughter always woke up before I did, making soft, bubbling noises until I dragged myself out of bed to pick her up. I would nurse her, dress her in warm layers, and step out onto the back porch. The oak leaves had shifted from brittle green to a fiery, burnt orange. They held a waxy sheen, baking in the crisp autumn air. Flocks of blackbirds hopped aggressively through the branches. A few dead leaves drifted down to the frost-covered grass. In the mornings, I laid a padded mat on the hardwood floor and let my daughter do tummy time. I sat cross-legged next to her, answering emails and slowly chipping away at my remote freelance work. By early afternoon, the sunbeam would slide off the windowsill and pool directly onto the floorboards. It created a thick, moving rectangle of pure warmth. My daughter would drag herself toward the edge of the light, swatting her tiny hands at the dust motes floating in the glare, pulling her fingers back, and swatting again. Hannah worked quietly in the adjacent room. Sometimes she would wander into the hallway, leaning against the doorframe with a mug of black coffee in her hand. Sometimes she would offer a stray thought. Sometimes she just watched us in total silence. Her presence was incredibly grounding, never suffocating. It felt as natural as the shadows of the oak tree shifting across the lawn. I slowly let my guard down. I got used to the fact that no one was going to violently throw the door open and demand to know what I was doing. Then came the silence. One night, I was sitting at my desk, organizing the final column of the timeline spreadsheet. Suddenly, a notification banner slid across the top right corner of my screen. It was a ping from a highly encrypted messaging platform. There was no username attached. Just the default, faceless gray avatar generated by the system. I clicked the message open. I am outside the gate. No greeting, no context, no identifying information, but I knew exactly who was typing. It was a freezing late autumn night. The front yard was buried under a thick layer of dead leaves. A vicious draft bled through the window panes, chilling the room. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't stand up to look out the window. A second message populated. "You weren't at the apartment." I asked the building manager, and he said you cleared out. "Where are you? Tell me right now." My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed. "I already told you everything you need to know." The last text I sent had the date and my final decision. You saw it. I hit send. Then I immediately went into the settings and permanently deleted the account. Outside the window, the darkness felt suffocating. The skeletal branches of the oak tree were illuminated by a single sodium street lamp near the country road, casting long, jagged shadows against the brick wall of the house. A sudden gust of wind tore through the upper canopy, violently flipping the leaves upward before dropping them back down. I finally stood up and walked over to the glass. The curtains were only half drawn. I could clearly see the dirt road beyond the iron gate, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. It was completely empty. There was no one there. The wind howled beneath the light post, kicking up a miniature tornado of dead leaves, spinning them wildly in the air before slamming them back into the dirt. It repeated the exact same motion over and over again. I stood by the window for a long time. Eventually, I walked back to the desk and shut down the MacBook. As the screen went black, The sharp edges of the desk dissolved into the shadows. The window frames, the dark corners of the room, everything was swallowed by the same unbroken blanket of night. 3 months later, on a mundane Tuesday morning, I dragged the final PDF of the timeline into the master folder. I scrolled through the massive digital document from the very first page to the last. I verified every piece of metadata. I locked the folder with a complex alphanumeric passcode, backed the entire drive up to an external Seagate hard drive, and permanently wiped the files from my primary laptop. Then, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a premium moving service. I booked a time slot for that weekend and confirmed the address of my new apartment in the city. The second call was to Hannah. I told her I was moving out next week. There was a heavy pause on the line. I heard the scraping sound of a wooden chair being pushed back. "You've made up your mind?" "I have." "All right. I can help you pack whenever you're ready. Just lock the door when you leave. Leave the spare key under the welcome mat." "Got it. I'll handle my mother if she asks. You don't need to give me the details. Just tell me you moved. That's all I need to know." "Understood." Right before I hung up, Hannah's voice crackled through the speaker again. It was a lower register this time, fiercely protective. "When you get back to the city, if anything happens, my number still works. Call me." I just said, "Okay," and ended the call. Over the next few days, I packed the remnants of my exile into cardboard boxes. My daughter's onesies, her wooden blocks, the fleece blankets. Next to the railing of the porch sat a faded, stuffed fabric rabbit. The acorns on the oak tree had turned a deep, rotting brown, shining with a slick, damp gloss in the morning frost. Walking past it, I picked one up, rolled it around in my palm, and placed it back onto the stone retaining wall. The morning of my departure was brutally cold. The asphalt was slick with a layer of heavy overnight frost. The massive box truck from the moving company arrived 15 minutes early. The 2 movers loaded my boxes and strapped them into the cargo bay. I buckled my daughter into her car seat and climbed into the passenger side of the cab. I looked out the window one last time. The silhouette of the rustic red brick house, the dead vines clinging to the masonry, were stained a dark, rusted crimson. In the harsh morning light, the vines looked like frozen veins of fire. The barren branches of the oak tree shivered violently in the wind. The last few dead leaves detached and fluttered down, blanketing the frostbitten grass in a thin, pale gold carpet. I turned my head away and adjusted my seatbelt. The massive engine of the truck roared to life, vibrating violently beneath the dashboard. The heavy tires crushed the frost-covered gravel, a sound that stretched and thinned out as we pulled further onto the asphalt, eventually turning into a low, untraceable hum. Halfway back to the city, we stopped at a highway service station. I carried my daughter out of the cab. The wind sweeping across the concrete was sharper and more biting than before. The vast agricultural fields in the distance had been entirely harvested. The exposed, frozen soil stretched out to the horizon in a bleak, uniform shade of dark brown. My daughter rested her cheek against my shoulder, staring out at the endless flatlands. The reflection of the wind-blown dead grass danced in her wide eyes. She didn't make a sound, she just watched. The moment we got back into the heated cab, she fell fast asleep. Her breathing warmed the collar of my wool coat, steady and incredibly comforting. I leaned back against the headrest, watching the landscape roll by. The edge of a massive gray cloud was suddenly outlined in brilliant, piercing sunlight before dragging its shadow across the highway. In the far distance, the jagged skyline of the city began to rise from the pale blue horizon. The overlapping geometry of the skyscrapers looked like a massive steel grid being slowly illuminated from the inside out. The truck barreled toward it at a relentless, unchanging pace. The speedometer needle was locked perfectly in place. We were not rushing, and we were not slowing down. As we passed the final toll plaza, the highway exploded into 8 lanes. The density of suburban sprawl and neon-lit strip malls multiplied exponentially. The streetlights flickered on. The distant high-rises were dotted with thousands of illuminated windows, blinking in erratic, unpredictable rhythms. It looked like someone had scattered silver glitter across a massive sheet of black velvet. My daughter shifted her weight in my arms, burrowing deeper into my chest to find a better angle. She kept breathing in her deep, unbothered sleep. I looked down. Her tiny hand was gripping the lapel of my coat. As we passed beneath a street lamp, a flash of yellow light illuminated her knuckles, gliding over the curve of her tiny fingernails before plunging back into darkness. As the truck pushed deeper into the city, the streetlights illuminated smaller, more intimate fragments of the streets. The metropolis unfolded before us at its own inevitable speed. The street lamps clicked past my window at exact, rhythmic intervals, like someone flipping the pages of a massive, invisible book. I didn't bother counting them. I didn't need to. They were just there, stretching infinitely into the distance, carving a brightly lit path forward. Within that fragile, flickering warmth, my daughter kept breathing. The city outside the window wrapped around the massive tires of the truck, rolling out a brand new layer of asphalt just for us. The truck kept moving forward. While my daughter slept, the road ahead was illuminated, streetlight by streetlight, block by block. My new apartment was located in a high-end, quiet residential district. It was completely on the opposite side of the city from where we used to live. It was a mid-rise building. My unit had east-facing windows that overlooked the canopy of a small community park and a sleepy, tree-lined avenue. The move-in was flawless. The movers placed the final box on the hardwood floor of the entryway. I verified the inventory, signed the clipboard, and slid my new keycard into the electronic lock on the door. I pushed it shut from the inside. The motion sensor lights in the hallway clicked off, one by one. I knelt down and sliced the tape off the first box. I pulled out stacks of folded sweaters and a few hardcover books. My daughter was wide awake in the carrier strapped to my chest. She quietly surveyed the sunlight, pouring into the empty room. The rays slicing through the window blinds created expanding pools of bright light on the bare wooden floorboards. The dust motes danced against the walls, coating the blank, empty apartment in a sheer membrane of golden light. That afternoon, I called the leasing agent for a small commercial workspace I had been eyeing. I confirmed the time to pick up the keys. The next morning, I strapped my daughter into her stroller and walked over to see the new office. It was incredibly close to the apartment, just a 10-minute walk down the avenue. My daughter's eyes darted wildly the entire trip, captivated by the boutique storefront windows, the shadows of the elm trees on the sidewalk, tracking everything in a continuous, unbroken line of curiosity. I slid the new brass key into the office door lock. It turned perfectly. When it hit the end of the cylinder, the heavy deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying snap. Over the following weeks, the architecture of our new daily routine began to solidify. In the mornings, I took her to the office and hammered out my remote contracts. At noon, we walked back to the apartment for lunch. In the afternoons, I chipped away at smaller projects. Before dusk, we took a slow stroll down the avenue and headed home. Her nap times and feeding schedules locked into a predictable grid. The chaotic fragments of a 24-hour day finally settled into their designated slots. I had found the absolute rhythm required to keep moving forward in this new existence. Occasionally, signals from my past life breached the perimeter, signals that required absolutely no response. Once, I found a standard manila envelope stuffed into my apartment mailbox. There was no postage stamp, there was no return address, and no signature. But the pressure of the ink, the severe slant of the handwriting, the exact spacing between the letters, I knew exactly who wrote it. I didn't rip it open. I just carried it upstairs and tossed it into a plastic storage bin reserved for unopened mail, right next to the previous envelope that had arrived exactly like it. I shoved the bin into the deepest corner of the bottom desk drawer. It didn't deserve a single second of my attention. One evening, while carrying my daughter back from the neighborhood park, I noticed a car parked at the four-way intersection. It was a silver BMW sedan. It was idling directly across the street, parked in front of a closed bakery. The engine was running, a thick plume of white exhaust curling into the freezing air, but the driver made no attempt to get out. I glanced at it exactly once. Through the tinted windshield, I saw the silhouette of the driver, the posture. Not sitting entirely upright, but not fully leaning back either. I didn't break my stride. I turned the corner onto my block. The street lamps above me flared to life, painting the cracked sidewalk in a warm, amber glow. The BMW didn't pull out to follow me. After turning the corner, I never once looked over my shoulder to check. I held my daughter tight and walked the entire length of the avenue. I swiped my fob, pushed through the glass doors of my building, and gave the night concierge a polite nod as I headed for the elevators. By the time the brutal winter began to thaw, the notebook documenting my timeline was completely filled. Every stray piece of information, every corroborated timestamp, every piece of circumstantial evidence. They had all been meticulously verified and locked into chronological order. It looked like a sprawling, perfectly scaled architectural blueprint, radiating outward from the center to the edges. That afternoon, while my daughter took her nap, I sat at my desk and read the completed timeline from the very first page to the last. When I finished, I closed the lid of the storage box and shoved it onto the top shelf of the bookcase. With everything finally resolved, I stood up and walked over to the window. The slanted, pale winter sunlight pierced through the glass, casting a long, warm rectangle of light across the wooden windowsill. The edge of the light crept agonizingly slow across the floor of the room. In the distance, the skeletal branches of the park trees shivered faintly in the wind. The sunlight hit the frost on the branches, illuminating them like a row of brilliant, golden blades slowly rotating in the air. When spring finally broke, my daughter had learned to sit up completely unassisted. Every afternoon, we went to the little community park. The freshly mowed grass smelled intensely green, striped with perfect, symmetrical lines left by the landscaping crews. My daughter would sit on the edge of our picnic blanket, staring intensely at a flock of pigeons pecking at the dirt a few yards away. Whenever the gray mass of feathers shifted, she would thrust her tiny hands out, trying to grab them. The spring breeze brushed against her cheeks. She squinted her eyes, and the corners of her mouth slowly curled upward. It was a developing, clumsy smile. At first, she couldn't quite hold the shape. It looked like a tiny, heavy window being forced open. But day by day, the muscles memorized the movement, and it became a permanent fixture on her face. One weekend at dusk, I was carrying my daughter back from the park. The streetlights had just flickered on. The towering dogwood trees lining the avenue were exploding with brilliant white and pale pink blossoms. A sudden gust of wind violently stripped the petals from the branches, showering the gray asphalt. They looked like thousands of shredded pieces of blue-tinted tissue paper rolling across the street. My daughter rested her cheek against my shoulder, absolutely mesmerized by the petals swirling in the wind. Her eyes locked onto a single, massive white petal spiraling through the air. She tracked it relentlessly until it hit the dark shadow of the curb and went still. When I turned the final corner onto my block, a man was standing on the opposite side of the street. He was standing directly beneath a street lamp. He was wearing a charcoal gray trench coat. It was unbuttoned, flapping wildly against his torso in the heavy wind. His arms hung limply at his sides. He wasn't holding anything. His gaze cut across the asphalt and locked instantly onto the tiny silhouette wrapped in my arms. He watched the way my daughter bounced slightly with every step I took. His eyes followed the line of her body, slowly tracking upward to my face, heavy and desperate like a stalk of wheat bowing under its own weight. The distance between his eyes and mine felt infinitely larger than the physical width of the street. It was a distance spanning an entire brutal winter, separated by a whole new season, so unimaginably far that his features were barely recognizable. I stared at David for exactly 2 seconds. He stood frozen under the halogen glow. The light cascaded down from the fixture, casting a soft, blurring halo over his shoulders. The illumination traced the sharp line of his coat, fractured by the violent shadows of the trembling dogwood branches overhead. Millions of microscopic dust particles danced in the blinding cone of light separating us. His lips parted, but it took a moment for the sound to escape his throat. The light rippled across his face like a swarm of silver insects, wrapping his silhouette in a suffocating, vibrating haze. "I was never looking for the documents," he said. His voice was incredibly weak. It was practically shredded by the wind tunneling down the avenue. There was no follow-up sentence. The words just hung there, bleeding into the cold air. I took one step forward. The streetlight illuminated the exact patch of sidewalk that had been drenched in moonlight only seconds before. My daughter turned her head slightly, glancing in his direction for a split second, then buried her face back into the crook of my neck. She didn't cry. She didn't shrink away in fear. She looked at him with the exact same casual indifference she gave to a fire hydrant or a pile of dead leaves. I looked right at him. Your belongings, the medical documents, and the finalized paperwork were all delivered via certified mail. I know they arrived at your office. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second. You just haven't opened the box. In that exact moment, the entire avenue went dead silent. The distant hum of traffic vanished. There was nothing but the violent roar of the wind ripping through the dogwood branches, snapping the blossoms off the stems. A flurry of pale pink petals whipped past David's leather boots, shoved violently by the draft, tumbling endlessly down the street. One single petal plastered itself against his shoulder. It stuck there for a second before sliding off the wool fabric, dropping to the pavement to join the hundreds of others being crushed underfoot. I didn't loosen my grip on my daughter. The halogen light flooded the space between the three of us. It felt like a massive sheet of theatrical canvas being aggressively folded and refolded in the wind. The heavy, warm weight of my daughter against my chest was the only real thing in the world. The street lamp cast a delicate, glowing halo across the fine hairs on her head. I didn't turn back to look at him. My daughter continued breathing perfectly in my arms. Behind him, the dogwood petals continued to violently cyclone through the air. The wind howled relentlessly, like an invisible loom trying to weave the shattered pieces of the street back together. One side of the avenue was bathed in the warm, blinding light of the street lamps. The other side stretched infinitely forward into the absolute crushing darkness of the night.